Arab food for years. He said, can you can that? I said, yes. So I designed a canning system for kusamakshi. He took it back to the Arab world.
Never heard that one before.
Yeah, speaking of the food, I've read that you always had lots of good food in your fridge.
Oh, I was always making things, all kinds of things, no single area. Like, then there was the trend, then there was the ultra car, which we never got to.
Right. Let's see. Go ahead and go into that, because I don't have it on here.
Well, a guy came out with an engine with 3 parts. And it was a rotary piston, because I didn't like a piston that moved up and down. And it only had 3 parts. And I thought, boy, if I can make a car with that engine in the wheel, I couldn't get the money for that. But a guy that was an automobile dealer backed me with a car. And I turned out the Ultra. And what happened is I couldn't get the engine made because I didn't have that kind of money. I just made the car. So I got a Villars engine, a small, lightweight, efficient motorcycle engine from England, and put it over the wheel and drove the wheel directly. But I wanted to put a rotary engine in the middle of the wheel, so you didn't have a transmission and everything. Couldn't do that. So I used tubular framing. You know what it looked like? The letter T. 1 wheel in the back and 2 wheels up front was one of the designs. And I used a tube for the gas tank instead of having the gas tank in the back of the car. And I used everything. Now, automobile wheels are suspended by joints that move up and down. They look like fingers. And the wheels move in and out when and that rubs the tires the wrong way on the ground. So I designed long extensions that stick out, and they went up and down in track out of the direction of the car. And I wound up with 32 parts of the car. That's when the Volkswagen had 5,500 parts. Mine had 32 parts. But I was not a salesman. And the guy looked at me and he says, I can get you all the money you want. He took the car, and I hadn't heard from him for 6 months or so. And I called him, he says, oh, I put it in storage. I says, I need that car. He's trying to raise funds. So you'll have to pay for storage. I had no money, so I lost the car. That's sort of like Leilani Village, all the same kind of story.
Money.
I was a lousy businessman. I guess that induced me to think of a moneyless system where just ideas were tested and used for the benefit of people. The fact that I was the world's worst businessman, that's what happened. I suppose it took all those conditions.
Did you start to see businessmen as bums back then?
Yes,
You did.
yes.
What stood out in
What?
what stands out in your experiences that turned you
Well,
away
my
from
mother went into
admiring businessmen?
my mother went into a store that was owned by 2 Arabs. And she said, I'd like to see that. So one of the Arabs said in Arabic to another Arab, boy, she's got nice tits, I sure like to fuck her. In Arabic. My mother understood Arabic. And then she said, I'd like to see that stuff on the top shelf. That son of a bitch in Arabic wants us to get the stuff down on the top shelf. Because she knew they were offensive. So she said, how about the other one on the top shelf? And after she gave a very hard time, she said in Arabic, I understand every word you said. I could put you in jail for what you said. And they asked, please, lady, I have a family. Yeah, I suffer a great deal. I'm a poor man, you know. So she let go. But anyway, she spoke 7 languages. So no one could speak without her understanding it. Okay? I wouldn't put that in.
It's interesting.
Yes.
I was going to ask earlier when you were talking about Moss and Irving.
Mars?
No, Moss. When you were talking
Oh,
about
Moss,
Jack
yeah.
Moss, was it him or somebody else that offered you a role in a film or something like that?
No, that was in the transit camp. To use their camera, to
No.
condition the immaculate tape.
No, Roxanne told me something about someone at some point offered you a role to be in a film or something like that. I don't know.
Oh yeah, Moss. Moss said, I'm a producer of film. Would you like to be in any movies? I said, no, particularly.
Never went there.
No. Because he knew I could do imitations too, and dialects, so he thought I'd make a good Al Pacino type guy in the old days. I can do all that sort of thing, but I don't do it, because I live with people like that, and I used to imitate them. I used to imitate Blackjack's father, Jack Captain's father, who was an Arab, you know.
Arab.
That the Americans call them Arabs. The Arabic. Arab is what it is.
All right, and how did you come in contact with Michael Shore? How did you meet him?
Mike Shaw knew a guy named Jerry, whose father owned a dress manufacturing industry. And he was going to school studying law at the time. And he came to see me when I lived in Elysian Park. That's $2.50 a month. But I had all kinds of gadgets I made. He was very impressed, and he talked to Mike Shaw. He says, you ought to meet this guy because he's way ahead of his time, you know. So Mike Shaw came to see me, and he talked to Earl Muntz about this guy. He can do anything. What do you want done? So I like a low-cost house to sell after the war. The GIs that come back from the war would like a low-cost house. So I designed a dome. He said that was too far out. He didn't want to go that routine. So I designed a house of aluminum. He said, why did you pick aluminum? That's because airplanes are made of aluminum. When the war ends, all these guys be laid off, and the aluminum would be available. So I said, that's a good idea. So I made a miniature aluminum house and showed him what it would look like. I think you have pictures of it. And from that, he said, how does your house differ from other houses? He said, wouldn't it be hot as hell living in an aluminum house? And the aluminum company told me that a particular alloy reflects 75% of the heat. I didn't know that. So the roof reflected the heat rather than absorbed it. And the floor plan was the simplest floor plan ever conceived, according to, well, Munn said I'm not an architect and I don't really know how to evaluate a house, so I'm going to get Frank Lloyd Wright's son, or his chief draftsman, to look at your blueprint. And so I said, do whatever you have to do. So he looked at the blueprints, he said, never go together. You got extrusions, you got 20 extrusions, and they'll never go together. So I said to him, you want to know how I maintain quality control so they'll go together? He said, no, I'm telling you, I'm older than you. It'll never go together. I stopped talking to him. And Munz turned to Mike Shaw and said, do you think he can do it? He says, I know he can do it. So he backed it, and I did it. And this guy was either Frank Lloyd Wright's chief draftsman or his son. Came over, he says, hey, you did a beautiful job. And Moore said, fuck you, to him. He said that loud. Morse was a very strange guy, because Harry Warner liked Morse as a producer. He's the guy that went to Mexico and paid the Mexicans high funds to appear in the film. And the government came to see Morse and said, if you pay them, they won't go to work in the morning. We pay them very little, and you're spoiling them. You can't shoot the picture here. They were shooting a movie, Paramount, in I think it was The Biscuit Eater, the movie they were shooting. Anyway, he had to give He sent truckloads of cigars and cigarettes and things like that for the Mexicans. He couldn't give them money. Anyway, Jack Moss knew Mike Shaw. Mike Shaw introduced me to Jack Moss.
Was the trend home a single wall construction?
Was it what?
Was it a single wall construction?
What do you mean by single wall?
In other words,
The walls were straight, wasn't a dome.
right, but were the walls double panels?
Yes.
Okay, there were two panels
Oh,
between the
yes.
inside and the outside.
Yes. The inside was a fiberboard, textured. The outside was aluminum, highly reflective.
Sheets.
Yes, corrugated. And between the aluminum was wool, like a foam, like cotton packed in there to insulate. And the furnishings were put in by a company that sold furniture. Mike Shaw said they will pay to have that furniture in there. So I said,
How
we
would
can't afford to have you design all the furniture, except the kitchen and the bathroom.
How would it stand up against hurricane?
Oh, Christ, it was as tough as an airplane. Could stand the 300-mile-an-hour wind.
It's locked together, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was, you know what a keyhole fit is? There was like a head of a nail, big, thick, and it fit in a hole and went down in a slot. It was locked together. No welding or anything like that. No screws or bolts.
Yeah, or nails.
No,
No nails.
no.
So was it Moss that
It
got
was
it onto?
fireproof too.
Yeah. Was it Moss that got it onto Warner Bros?
Yes, he was the producer of films, but he saw the trend home. He liked it so much, he figured I can do anything. That's why he backed the 3D picture. And he said, you did it in less time than you said it would. But he asked me, how much will it cost to develop it? And I gave him a figure, and he wrote a check for twice the amount. I said, why, you made a mistake, you wrote a check for twice the amount. He said, no, you inventors say, well, I need another lens or something. Can you do it for that? I said, easily. So I said, okay.
Now, the train home, it was first shown at Warner Bros. And then it moved, right?
Yeah,
Set it up
but
somewhere else.
then after it sold for $5,250, and they were getting $15,000 for prefabs then. And they wouldn't let it go up in that neighborhood because it would change the value of the other houses. And the head of the FHA said it's the best house he ever saw. I didn't see this, but he was talking to Maislish and Muntz. And he said, I'd like a piece of the action and I'll get it built all over. It's the best house in America. And I want a piece of the action, meaning money. So they said if we had to do that, we couldn't sell it for that price. Because otherwise you're not building any of them anywhere. And he won out. They never could build any of them. I am told they built 20 of them somewhere. That's all I know about it. I had left.
That project was
I
probably.
never got paid. I get $25 a week for working on the design. If it worked, I never got paid for it, other than that pay.
But that
Same with
project,
Eli Catherine and Harry Toretto, at $25.
they helped work on it, right?
What's that?
They helped you work on it?
Yes.
And,
And Ben Reyes, another guy, a friend of Mike Shaw. They were in publicity. They were an advertising agency. And they helped Eli Catherine, myself, and Toretto put it together. And then we timed it, and it would take 10 men 8 hours to put up the building.
and you designed the whole factory that would turn them out.
Yes, but they never got that far. We never got to the factory. It was round the factory.
And how'd that work? It just manufactured in a
Oh,
circle
yeah.
and then
Yeah,
taken out.
finished. Very efficient, at the time.
Now, you visited Reverend May Taylor from the Church of the Living
Yes, that came about by a guy named Felix Frazier. He was a president of a company called Technical Associates. He said, Jacque, I know you don't believe in metaphysics, but there's a Reverend May Taylor, and she is really psychic. So I said, I've been there many times, and you ought to go see her. So I went to the church. It was called the Angels Messengers of the Living Dead. That was the name of her church. And I sat there, and she, after the sermon she gave, strictly metaphysics, she pointed to different people and said, you had a brother killed in 1928 in all of you. I said, almost everybody in the congregation. She told, you know, we're amazed at the truth, you know, that she gave. So when I came into the church, I did not sign the guest book. I figured that's how she worked. Everybody signed the guest book. So she went in the back and see what she's got on people in the Hall of Records. She knew everybody in the congregation, except me. So after the sermon, she called everybody, skipped over me. So I had 10 friends come in, but dispersed to the church. And she skipped over those people.
You remember
I said,
any
do
of those?
not sign the guest book, I said to them.
You remember any of those friends you had come?
Oh, they're dead. Catherine Giretto, Erickson, Lolly, well, they're all dead now. I lived longer than most everybody but Eli. He's still alive.
Was Eli doing anything social, or was he?
No, he was never quite into that. He became a businessman. He was chief draftsman for Raymond D. Iser. He introduced me to Raymond D. Iser that made anti-icing equipment. No, he was never around. He was younger, you know what I mean, than the guy.
Now, the visit to the Church of the Living Dead, was that in L.A.?
Yes.
And
The Angels Messengers of the Living Dead. And there was another metaphysical church that was quite interesting. It was a brand new building, it looked nice, and it had on the windows tear gas. Don't break into this church or attempt to remove any object that tear gas in there. Then it had wishing wells where you throw money in and make a wish. And there were children running on the ground near the church. There was a beautiful grounds. And there was an old man with crutches, and he said, stop this running on this sacred ground. It was amazing for me to see this guy. You know, how converted he was to that horseshit, low-grade horseshit. Stop this running on the sacred ground. And another guy in Elysian Park where I lived was an old Englishman with a beard. And I asked him what he did. He said he was a chemist. So we called him alchemist, you know. And he's the guy that used to say, he used to call up at my house, hey, Jacque, have you got any slop, eh? I said, what do you want it for? He said, I have to feed the nanny goats. He had nanny goats, you know. And so I said, what did you say? I wanted to get that dialect real. Have you got any slop, eh? And that's what he used to say. And I used to learn how to imitate
That's in Hawaii?
Cockney.
That's in Hawaii?
No, that's here, in L.A. rather.
Right.
Elysian Park. And then I knew 2 farmers, you know, and I learned to imitate them. And I imitated their values. I says, Zeke, have you heard about them Wright brothers? He says, yes, I did. They're trying to build a flying machine. He says, they ain't never going to build no flying machine. If the Lord wanted man to fly, he'd have been born with wings. That's the way they talk. And then I met some Germans, and they were talking, and I heard them talking, and I imitated them. They said, Lutz, did you heard about the Russians? They say they have launched a satellite out into space. How can you see what the Russians say they launched out into space? That's all Russian lies and propaganda. You know, and so I learned to imitate all these different people. Blackjack's father, you know, The Arabs, the Italians, everybody.
Did you have many Germans around when you were growing up, or?
Yes, there were Germans. The American Bund. You have any German-American Bund? That's a Nazi party in America. I went to their meetings to hear what they got to say. I always wanted to go to the source, because I didn't believe later whatever anybody said about anybody. You know, everybody had opinions that all Italians were gangsters and all Swedes were dumb and Polacks were tall and ignorant people, and the Swedes were unemotional, you know, all kinds of stuff. It was flagrantly around, you know. And then when I found out that people were unsane, I learned that word from Korzybski. Unsane rather than insane. Unsane means given misinformation.
Well, the movies perpetuated those.
Oh, yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Movies were awful. But I knew that.
I think you might have talked about this yesterday. You talked about, was it going to Brazil?
Well, that was very short. It was to go there on an expedition. And then we were going to go up the Amazon River. And somebody donated a yacht. And they put me in charge of the scientific investigation. And then there was another guy, a physicist, put in charge. And he molested a child and he was arrested and the whole thing disintegrated. Never got on the yacht, never went anywhere.
And that's where...
It was released in a newspaper that we were going on that expedition.
Yeah.
And the guy, De Costa was his name, that came from Brazil and set it up. He said, Doc, I have to change your name to Frescott. I said, why? Because Fresco means gay in Brazil.
In Brazil?
So he called me Frescott in the article.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever saw that.
Yeah, I saw it. James Holther?
Yeah, he was the guy that organized it.
And
He was a metaphysician.
really?
And he was the one that molested the person?
No, that was the physicist.
Dr. Roy Booth?
Roy Booth, he was another guy, he was okay, Dr. Roy Booth. He was a guy that was in contractor for housing, and he wanted me to do the Trend Home over again. And then the Aluminum Company of America, they had some representatives that were going to build a new house, so I drew the Trend Home modified slightly and simplified for the Aluminum Company of America. And this guy submitted to the Aluminum Company, and they said Fresco is 50 years in advance of architects. He says, do you want to go that advance? Because it doesn't look like a house. The Aluminum Company wanted it to look like a house, you know. So I said, no, I wouldn't do that. I can't do that, you know. Anyway, some newspaper got it, and these two guys that hired me, the architect and the engineers, they said he was in advance of his time in a newspaper article. Did you ever see that?
Well, no, I haven't seen that one. Was that in the 60s?
I don't
In
remember.
Florida or Miami?
It was, I don't remember where it was.
Okay.
Just
And
another one of those things.
yeah, well, the trip to Brazil during that time,
We never went to Brazil.
were you in Florida or California?
California,
When, okay.
yes.
And yeah, the Pan American Scientific Association, was that what organized it?
That was their organization.
And Esperanza?
Esperanto
Yeah.
is a language that was supposed to be universal, that everybody in the world would learn. And then somebody came up with interlingua, but none of them were any good. They were not like scientific language that was not subject to interpretation. So I discredited those languages.
Do you remember when they went out to go build Brasilia? Do you remember when all that was happening?
Oscar Niemeyer, he was a communist architect, and he designed Brasilia. And there was no way to cross the streets there. There was no coffee shops. because the Brazilians like to go to coffee shops, and he designed a city with odd shapes, random, no plan, you know. He was a good guy, nice guy. They say he's still alive. He's supposed to be like 103 years old, 104 years old. They say he's still alive. Oscar Niemeyer. I never met him.
And at your age, he became president of the Communist
Oh, he did?
Association or something.
I didn't know
When he
that.
was 95.
Is that right?
Back in LA
I never met him.
you used to hold sessions in LA, right?
I had what?
At your home, you used to hold sessions.
Yes.
You talk to people,
Miami too.
and you also
Mostly Miami. Very little in LA.
you taught. Did you teach? Were you a drafting instructor in LA? Did you teach drafting or architectural design?
Well, I had some classes attending art and other things, but the real psychology was in Florida. I mean, social stuff.
And how did you meet Forrest Ackerman?
Somebody told Forrest Ackerman he was into science fiction. So he told that this guy lives that way, you know, he lives in the future. So Forrest Ackerman came over to my lab and he was very impressed. He says, "You should run for president." I said, "No, I wouldn't live very long if I did." Anyway, he came to several sessions. Then he said, "Would you mind coming to a science fiction meeting where we have Ray Bradbury, all the science fiction writers, they go to a meeting and they talk about science fiction. If you talk to them about the future." So I did at several meetings, talked about the distant future, based upon science. And that's all I remember. I just talked twice there. And they were all there. And since then, a lot of things have come out in science fiction, but they weren't polished off, they weren't finished. You can tell because they never got detail.
Was that after the Trin film? You met Ackerman?
No, that was, I don't think so. I think it was before that.
And you also presented to Disney, right?
Yes, maybe 15 years before he built Disney World. I brought blueprints and plans of a city, but it was different. He built it to entertain people. I want to build it to change their values. They'd walk in one way and come out oriented, you know. So I had designed a home of the future with a conveyor belt so no one could linger. They had to be moved through. And there was a family, not real, they were made by people that made wax figures. They had people, but they'd talk, but they wouldn't face the camera. So they were, out of their mouth came sound, and the girl was looking at the wall, and it was three-dimensional scenery. And she says, "We have everything now." And right then, bingo, it changed to what you call virtual images. When the image was outside the wall, walk in the room. And I said, whenever you said we've got it all, bingo, change that to the next phase. Always, so that the future was not fixed. I wanted to build a Disney World. I didn't go into detail with Disney. I just submitted the drawings. And I had to wait in the front office. His staff took him back, and they said he's not interested. So I left. And about 15 years later, he came out with Disney World. But he used some drawings of the round city. There was some of them were round, but he never built that. He built something else.
You had been drawing circular cities for a long time, right?
Long before that. You can find dates, I think, long before that. I got the idea from a deer.
Yeah. Do you remember wanting to set up, along with other people, a scientific center in San Bernardino?
Son of one.
A scientific center in San Bernardino, California? Do you
I
recognize
really
it?
don't remember. Tell me more about
There's just an article in one of the collages you have where it talks about a group of scientists want to set up a scientific
it.
center.
Oh, that was the group that was going to go to Brazil.
Oh, okay.
They were going to do that later.
And then, did you want to set up a school for industrial engineering?
Industrial design.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I never had the money to do that.
And
I wanted to.
the Art Center School in Hollywood?
Art centers where I taught architectural and industrial design.
Mhm.
But the guy wanted to be a 5-year course, but the kids were ready in a month to go out and do the work, you know. It was very fast. So he came to me and says, hey, this is a 5-year course. You don't want to work that fast, you know.
Was that before or during or after the train home?
After the trend.
And do you remember a guy?
Oh, I went to a school for art called Jefferson McNamara School. Jefferson, you know who he is? He was a cartoonist, I think. But he opened an art school, and after the war, on the GI Bill, I picked that school. So the art instructor came over to my table and he says, you should be teaching here. You shouldn't be going here. I said, I'm tired. That's after the trend home failed. It was cut down, you know. I went to art school. I was very tired after a long, drawn-out venture. And I wanted to relax, but I needed an income to do that. So the GI Bill gave you so much a month. And they paid for Jefferson McNamara. And the guy said to the art instructor, I forgot his name, he said, you should be teaching. He said, so Jefferson McNamara said, we make more money having less teachers. So Art Center School, he used to teach at Art Center School on Coenga Pass or somewhere. And the guy hired me to teach there. So he had me go from one room to the other. One room I would teach architecture, another room industrial design, another room fashion illustration. Teaching the whole works, running the whole school. I didn't earn very much, but he was a real uneducated guy, very ignorant. Couldn't talk about anything. But anyway, I did work there for a while.
Yalta Menuhin used to attend your sessions, right?
I did what?
Yalta Menuhin?
Yehudi Menuhin? No, his sister
Right.
used to attend my seminars.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I asked, what is music?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You remember a guy who worked for the New York Times Public Relations?
No, I wouldn't. What was his name?
I don't have it.
Anyway.
Right, he wanted to get you in Washington in planning.
Oh, yes. Oh, there was a guy that did, I remember. He said, if I can't sell you, I'll take my life.
Mm-hmm.
He said, you're absolutely saleable. He was in advertising too. And so he couldn't get anybody interested. He took his life. This is a true story. He was a very nice guy. He felt what I was saying was so logical, he felt that everybody would take to it. But I told him, I said, try to tell him that it's not an easy job. Even though it's logical, what's logical to an illogical person? You know what I
You
mean?
didn't realize the environment most people come from.
Sure. I tried to tell him that. He said, no. He says, what you've got to say makes sense. He says, well, I can't sell you, I'll take my life. It's not worth living. So anyway, he took his life.
Was that in Los Angeles?
I'm not sure.
And
He
remember,
came from New York, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know, what paper was it in?
It's from an old talk you gave.
Oh,
Remember John Croker?
John Crowther, Jacque Fresco, we call him,
Oh.
yes. Jacque Fresco taught social science. He went to school to teach social science. And we used to meet at his house. And I was always breaking him in as to what the Venus Project, there was no Venus Project then. It was about the future. I had to talk to Jack a lot. He was very well read and he took to it. He was very interested in it, but he was going to college at the time studying sociology. And then I didn't see him for years. I invited him to come out here. He came out with his wife about 10 years ago. But he was very sick, I think. He had pneumonia. And I don't know what happened thereafter.
Oh, did he have sound equipment that he...
Yeah, the church was across the way. And every Sunday the minister would go off as Omni Domini, loud as hell with the speaker system. So he recorded it and played it back at the church, real loud. And the church says, we can't conduct our sermons with your thing. But this was Jacque Fresco, John Fresco.
And this isn't really that important, but in one of your old talks, you talked about attending a Dr. Kinsey lecture. I just want to know who he was.
Who's that?
Dr. Kinsey?
Yeah, he was, I forgot Dr. Kinsey. He wrote about freedom of sex and sexual analysis.
Oh, the guy with the Kinsey Institute?
The Kinsey Report.
Yeah, you said you attended a lecture, and he told people about a brother and a sister who the sister was very loving.
Yes, and she said, my brother needs sex and he's not able to get it, so she had sex with him because she cared. And Kinsey wrote about that, which was very different than conventional thinking. What do you mean, a brother and sister? A cunt on any person works the same way, But there were standards that they had. They were all arbitraries, and you couldn't conceive of a guy touching his sister's tits, It just was not acceptable. I never behaved that way because I was indoctrinated along certain lines that you don't screw members of your own family, I could have been easily persuaded to that direction, but I never took it on.
Now, Father Dunn and Father Dempsey, how did you meet them?
Well, they came to one of my sessions with the white collar. I said, Father, what are you doing here? He said, well, I want to hear your point of view. I hear you're an atheist, a non-believer. I said, that's true. I am a non-believer. But you may become a non-believer if you stay here. He says, never. Anyway, I went to work on them, and they turned around, but it took a month or so. And Dempsey turned around. They're the one that told about the woman that has the power of telekinesis.
Yeah.
When I exposed that stuff to them, that helped undo the metaphysical stuff. But they were Catholic priests, and one nun. The nun left with the priest. I don't know where they are now.
You know what church they were at?
No, not at all.
Now,
There was a guy named Father Coughlin, a Catholic, used to talk against the Jews, burn them, they killed Jesus, on the radio every Sunday. And they were leaning toward Father Coughlin.
Really?
And I said, that Jews, I said, there's no such thing as a Jew. They said, what do you mean? So I said, well, somebody made a speech with a beard, a small beard, and they followed him and they were called Jews. But what were they before that? Then another guy made a speech and they were Lutherans. But a Lutheran is not a special thing. The Lutheran has a certain type of blood. It's just like anybody else's blood. And some fathers can't give a transfusion to their kids because they have a different blood type. So they kept saying, I have Russian blood, I have Polish blood, I have Jewish blood. There's no such thing. A Jew is a guy that follows that pattern. A Catholic is a guy that follows the Catholic pattern. What were they before they were Catholics? What were they before Jesus came? They believed in many different gods. So I said, with all the invasions over the many centuries that man has been on earth, there can't be a pure race. You know what I mean? Let's keep the white race. They had notions like that. Because that doesn't include time. I can't imagine any civilization that was not invaded and raped, and I don't know how pure anybody is, or what kind of mixtures of genes you have. Nobody knows that. But that they always look back, because people will give you a picture of what happened in the past, that in the past you were related to Abraham Lincoln. But nobody was ever related to Al Capone. You know, they always do a history search, and you're always related to the King of England, or something like that, you know. But I never liked that, tracing your ancestry. You know, how far back do you go? There was a time when my ancestors lived in trees, baboons like, and they knew nothing. So all that shit fell in the realm of metaphysics. Do you ever hear that service? They'll tell you about your ancestors. On TV, it's still running.
How did you meet Frank Scully?
Who?
Frank Scully?
Come here.
Frank Scully?
Oh, Frank Scully was a writer. He was a Catholic. And somebody told him about me because I built a flying saucer in 1931. And he came to see me and he said, will you make a contribution to the book? I'm going to do a book called Behind the Flying Saucers. He's going to interview people. So he said the publishers will pay you for interviewing people. And so I interviewed them. They were all metaphysicians. They never described the flying saucer, although they were taken on trips and examined by Saucerians. And they said the reason they came here was to tap our power lines and take the energy out. And I said, well, anybody that can travel millions of light years through space, have the sun out there, they can take the energy directly. Well, they said, I don't know about that. But they were so low grade. They gave them examinations, they checked their teeth, and you know, all typical shit. Very. I'd say if they were Saucerians, they could have watched our television and known not to come here. Because I said there may be intelligent life out there, and the only proof is that they haven't come here, if they're intelligent. Why should they want to come here? This is such a primitive society. Anyway, I said all that, and he wrote about that in the book. Says Fresco only believes in that which you could measure.
Right.
I think he said that.
He did. Yeah.
Okay. He said, if I put everything you said in that book, I couldn't sell the book, he said to me. And Frank Scully wrote a book called Fun in Bed. And it's about, he was hospitalized once, and he played games, but it was not about sex.
And then what about the work with Donald Powell Wilson?
Yes. Lou Stolman made a movie on Donald Powell Wilson. He talked to him after they made a movie called My Six Convicts, based on a book he wrote. Do you know about the book? And then he came to see me. He came to my lab. He said, you're more advanced than any psychologist I know. Do you mind if I send people I can't handle to you? Donald Powell Wilson, he was a very famous psychologist. So he used to send people he couldn't handle to me when I was practicing psychology. And the APA got hold, American Psychological Association, and they sent a news article to the Miami Herald. And the Herald said, this guy lives on a yacht. He has a PhD from a non-accredited school, you know, all that sort of stuff. It was a negative article. So I told all the clients to read that article, and if they still wanted to come to my sessions, they could. They all came to the sessions.
So
The article did not affect him.
So you dealt with Donald Powell Wilson in Florida?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
No, California.
For him, okay.
Yeah.
And then, but all that happened in Florida
Yeah.
with APA.
That was in California.
Go ahead and talk about how you got the honorary degrees
Oh,
from the guy.
a guy named Flodine, who ran a school, chiropractic school, health school, all this kind of shit you've been exposed to. He said, will you mind teaching psychology at my school? I says, I'm not a graduate of any school. I have no PhDs. He says, well, I'll give you a PhD, honorary degrees, if you teach at my school. Well, I said, it's very different. I'll be stepping on toes. So he said, isn't it the purpose of science to step on toes? I said, I suppose so. I said, what if it's your toes? He says, even if it's my toes. So I taught that. And when they graduated, they wore those hats, all the things, but it was not an accredited school. So Jerry, a friend of mine, the guy that knew Humphrey, said, you can teach psychology, but you'll be attacked from all fronts if you haven't gone to a conventional school. He says, I've studied with you and I know you're right, but he says, society will condemn you. So I set those degrees aside. He gave me honorary degrees. He says, because you know more about human behavior than anybody I ever met. But that didn't count.
Yeah. Did you ever step on his toes?
Yes, I did. I attacked metaphysics.
Let's see. Now, how did you get into Project Moonbase? You wanted to write you wrote a script, right?
Yeah, I wrote a script and Fari Ackerman submitted to the producer. I forgot his name.
Was it called Bright
Jacque
Future?
something. Jacque what?
Did you write a script called Bright Future?
Bright Tomorrow.
Yeah, that's it.
It's just buzzed. I mean, the battery died. Anyway, it will die shortly. So, I forgot his name, Jack Hines or something like that, the producer of the picture. Remember his name?
No, I don't have it either.
But it's in some newspaper.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said, he looked at the thing I wrote and he said, it's terrific. When he went to the bank for money to produce a picture, they said, nobody knows Fresco, but they know the guy that wrote the story. What was his name? Heinlein, Robert
Yeah.
Heinlein. He wrote the story. So they said, I can't get money from the bank on your name. I have to get known cameramen, Paramount, or Hal Roach produced the picture. Hal Roach Studios in California. And I had nothing to do with the special effects and the models. Never got paid.
What was your script about?
It was about the future. The script about the future was, in those days it was about computers operating the world. And he thought that was fascinating, but he said, I can't get money to produce it.
You lost the script. I wish we
And-
still had it.
And halfway through the picture, he ran out of money, and he says, he can't even sell the picture unless I signed a quit claim deed. I signed a quit claim deed, and I was never paid. And he died of a heart attack shortly. So I never got paid for that either.
Now, how did you get work on The Naked Eye?
Lou Stoneman did The Naked Eye. He said he wanted to do a film on a guy named, he was a Brett something or other, who was a super photographer in black and white. They even did books on him. He wanted to do a movie on him, a documentary on him. And he said, will you do the special effects in the movie? I said, well, what do you need? He said, well, he was very good at throwing darts into a target, things like that. Can you make a dart go into a target? I said, I can do that, yes. And I made all kinds of special effects that he was noted for. And what I did is I had a magnet holding a dart above the target. And I turned the magnet off and the dart would go right in the center. He was amazed at how I solved all those problems for him. And it was the special effects that really carried that movie.
Yeah, it did really well.
Huh?
It did really well.
Yeah, it won a Flaherty Award.
Yeah, it was nominated for an Academy Award documentary.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I know it
saw
won
it.
a Flaherty Award.
Well, it hasn't been part of the well,
Anyway.
there's only the museum that has it. But
I don't hardly remember that. I don't know if Lou Stoneman is alive, but he was my age about the time.
how did you meet him?
Lou Stoneman, I think it was a doctor of psychology, the guy that sent his clients to me.
Oh,
They made a movie. Lou Stoneman was a cameraman.
that's right. Yeah.
And I think that's how I met him.
Yeah, I think you might have said earlier. Was that in LA when you worked on that?
LA.
Okay. And then you moved shortly after that to
Yes,
Florida.
I may have moved there.
And mainly you moved to Florida because the bridge, first of all, right? The bridge, the Golden State Bridge.
In New York, no, I moved to Florida because it was so cold in the winter. We had no heat.
Well, no, I mean you moved to Florida from California because the bridge overtook your lab, right?
Oh, yes,
And then smog.
yes. They built a freeway
Yeah.
in LA. I lived on Riverside Drive, and the government paid me for my lab very little money. Because the guy that built it for me was right next door, and he said, you can get a lot of money for it if you fight it in court. I didn't want to do that.
And how did you travel to Florida? Did you drive?
I believe California, I think I took a bus, Greyhound bus, in the old days. Flying was not typical in America. They had airplanes called Ford Tri-Motor, which was very different than the airliners today. And not everybody flew, very few people flew.
And how long did you live on your yacht? For a
Under
couple,
what?
On your yacht for a couple years?
Oh, maybe a year,
That's when you treated the patients,
yes,
the addicts.
yes.
And did you also have a therapy office on 3126 Coral
Yes.
Way?
I don't remember, it was after the yacht.
Yeah.
And I had people come to me from all over. I didn't charge them very much. If they weren't working, they paid nothing. If they were working, they paid, I think, $10, which I was very lenient.
Now, when did you deal with the KKK?
That was a long time ago.
Was that the first trip to Florida?
Yes, it was right after the transit camp.
Okay. I got all the
It
details
was
on
in
that.
the transit camp.
Hmm.
I did all the experiments on the immaculate pig and the other animals. The animals I was raising, I couldn't take care of. There was so many of them. So I designed a long cage, and I got the materials from a building surplus that were all thrown out. The grid material, the plaster's mesh, which I made for the raccoon cages, and it was long. So I made a bunch of turnstiles, you know what they are? And when the raccoons got food, they got it the other end. They had to turn all those turnstiles, and the turnstiles swept the crumbs out of their cage. The bottom of the turnstile was a brush. The brush cage through a grid, open grid floor. The red ants ate all the shit down below. So I didn't have to monitor the animal. I conditioned dogs to turn the water on and put a lever on the hose. So the dog pulled the lever, I gave the dog food. And then I put the food there, and the dog would learn to pull the lever, and the raccoons would get water. But I had to do that if I wanted to sell stuff to the North Miami Zoo. I had to improvise. I also met Masato there in a transit camp.
What did you show Lou when he came? When he came and you showed him different things?
My lab.
Was Masato your age?
Was
Was
yeah,
he your
he's
age?
about my age.
Is he
He's
still alive?
probably dead.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't heard from him in years. Lou, I showed him my lab and all the stuff I was working on, and he talked to the guy that wrote my 6 Convicts, Don Powell Wilson. He told him, and Wilson came out to my lab, and he said, you know, Skinner would be interested in your work. So Skinner's people came out, I forgot their names, but anyway, they bought a lot of equipment from me that I made for them.
Let's see.
I'd never met Skinner. I met Keller Breland and the other people that used the Skinner stuff, where the chicken would pick a piano and play some simple music. Did you know about that?
Yeah.
Skinner conditioned. Then they took that on tour, and they had this old black woman washing clothing, and the ram would run into her butt. They did terrible things with it,
Mm-hmm.
but they made a lot of money with it.
Yeah. They opened up a school to train people how to
Is
do
that
that.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now you remember the cowboy pictures you showed the little girls to see if,
Oh,
if they would imitate? Was that in California or Florida? Do you remember?
I was in Florida, I believe, and I didn't know that was in New York years ago. I asked them to bring their kids, little girls. I wanted to see what would happen. And I just ran the pictures. It's 2 guns and the cowboys walking around like that. And the little girls personified. They did imitate whatever they saw in the movies. But I wanted them there for a couple of weeks so I could see what happens over a period of time. And all the kids wanted cowboy suits that I knew. All the boys, they had leather things sticking out and 2 guns and a cowboy hat. That was typical of kids.
Yeah.
Very few wanted to be an aviator, you know. They wanted to be policemen, firemen, and cowboys. Because all the movies were Buffalo Bill and out of court. A guy that got out of court all the time. They tied him up, he got out. And they were cliffhangers. You know what they are? Cliffhangers. The girl was tied to the railroad tracks, and the train was coming, and then they had to come next week,
Yeah.
and the train stopped just in front of the girl. Or cliffhangers. Or a guy fell off a cliff and he was hanging there, and you saw the Colorado River way down below, and next week would be continuous. They were serial, and you always had to come back to see that. That's when I learned to sing the Greek song.
Oh.
And when I went to Greece this time on the world tour, I sang the Greek song,
Yeah.
and they loved
You
that.
still remember it? I saw that video.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really? You
Yeah.
saw that? They made it, they released it?
Yeah.
On the internet?
Mhm.
I never saw
Where
it.
you're singing that, yeah.
Yeah. And I learned Italian songs and Jewish songs and French. I was a fond de la patrie, you know, like a Frenchman. And a lot of different things like that. But that was to get by in that world. It was a terrible world, I thought.
Yeah.
I thought I'd like to live in a dome years ago, and that's why I submitted a dome. And they said, that's too far out.
Well, now you do.
Huh? Yeah.
So now you do.
Well, I never built what I wanted, just like, it would have been different. Larger, much larger and different.
Do you remember your home at 3112 23rd Street? Tobacco Roadhouse?
What?
The Tobacco Roadhouse?
Yes. It looked like Tobacco Road, old. So the taxes were very little.
Where was
Inside was stainless steel, all modern.
that? Where is that?
23rd Street, Florida.
Yeah.
It was in
Oh,
Florida,
in Miami?
Miami.
Is that the house with black tar on it?
Yes. Yeah. It looked like Tobacco Road.
Well, you've seen it?
I've heard it described a lot. Do you have any pictures of it?
I never took a picture.
They have one picture of it in one of the newspapers.
You did?
There's one picture of it in the newspaper.
Yeah, it was an old shack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you were. Didn't you build it?
No.
Were you modifying it?
Only the inside.
Yeah.
Was updated.
And that's where I read about you used to make metal models.
Make one?
Metal models.
Yes.
That's who talked to you about that?
Carl.
Yeah. I figured.
I thought Carl took a picture of it or something too.
Yeah, that was an old house. We used to hold sessions there.
Okay. Was it cramped?
With what?
Was it cramped?
Always.
That was after.
Alcoholics, drug addicts, and normal kids. That were Joe Sula's. I don't know if Joe Sula went to the old tar house or another house. I don't remember.
So you moved from the boat to there?
I don't remember for sure.
I
I bought a house. I bought a new house for $16,000. I made a down payment on it, and I was married at the time, had 2 kids, and gave the house to the wife and the kids.
And then you went to the Tobacco Roadhouse.
Yes.
Okay. And I guess around that time, you worked on a project where Alco and Major Realty Company collaborated, and they flew you up to Philadelphia.
Yes.
You remember
Yes.
that? What did you have to do for that?
I designed a modified trend home.
Oh, that's when you did that. Okay.
Yeah. And then they did an article on it, something saying he was too far ahead of his time. I don't know if you ever read that. The Miami Herald.
I've read something similar in something else, but let's see. You remember?
Really out of tape.
Really? There's not much left. You've been to the West Indies, right?
Yes.
And you traveled with a cook, Andre.
Andre, yes.
Who was he?
Andre was a Canadian, kind of a chubby guy. And he told me a lot of lies, and he was a con man. And he painted a picture of license on his automobile. He didn't even have license. I didn't know that. And then he said, Jacque, you have a lot of oil paintings. You should sell them. So he took them to Canada with him, and he said he never sold them. But he sold them. He never paid me for it. And when he went back to Canada, he let me drive his car he had here with the painted lights. I never knew that. I never studied it, you know. And finally, federal agents came up to me and they said, do you know Andre? I said, yes, I do. Did you know he was here illegally? I said, no. And he was here illegally, and they picked him up in Canada. I don't know what happened. Andre was he was nice to me. He had a home on Miami Beach, and when he went to Canada, he said you can stay there. But I didn't know he never paid for it or anything like that.
That's how con men work.
He said he had a yacht that was bigger than mine. And when he went to the West Indies, they invited him to be a member of the Yacht Club. And they treated him well with great honors and feasts and all that, just by saying he had a yacht. I had a yacht, but I never was a member of the Yacht Club or anything like that. And when I got my yacht outfit, I was the captain of the boat. I used to operate it. And so I went to a movie, and the guy came out that owned the movie, tore up the ticket. He said, give him back his money. He's a captain. And just this outfit, so I wore the captain outfit, and I was treated greatly wherever I went. I was treated very well. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a little cold in here.
Yeah, you kept that outfit for a while.
Yeah, I kept it after I sold the boat.